Nodin felt the cold seep into his bones, a familiar companion on these endless plains. The wind, a relentless sculptor of the land, whipped around him, tugging at the brim of his worn hat. He squinted, his eyes, accustomed to the vastness, scanning the horizon. Nothing but the endless expanse of the prairie, a sea of muted greens and browns under a sky that stretched on forever. It was a loneliness that could swallow a man whole, yet Nodin had found a strange comfort in it, a quiet understanding with the untamed wilderness. His ranch, a solitary sentinel against the elements, stood a mile or so distant, a cluster of weathered wood and stone that had been his sanctuary for 2 decades. He'd built it with his own hands, each timber and stone a testament to his stubborn will. He wasn't a man of many words, preferring the company of his horses and the silent judgment of the land. Folks in the nearest town, Redemption Gulch, called him the Millionaire Rancher, a title he bore with a quiet indifference. The gold he'd found in a forgotten creek bed years ago had bought him land, cattle, and a solitude he cherished. But wealth, he'd learned, couldn't buy peace of mind, not when the echoes of a past he thought he'd buried still whispered on the wind. He remembered the warnings he'd heard in town, the hushed conversations about the changing times, the increasing tensions between the settlers and the native tribes. He'd always dismissed them, believing his isolation was his shield. But lately, a disquiet had settled in his gut, a feeling that the fragile peace he'd cultivated was about to shatter. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken threat, like the calm before a prairie storm. He'd seen it before, felt it in his bones, the subtle shift in the wind, the unnatural stillness of the animals. This was different, though. This was a human storm brewing, and he was caught right in its path. He urged his horse, a sturdy bay named Comanche, forward. The animal's hooves kicked up dust, a fine, reddish powder that coated everything. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a deceptive beauty that belied the harsh realities of the land. Nodin pulled his shawl tighter around him, the rough wool a small comfort against the biting wind. He thought of the empty ranch house, the silent rooms that held more memories than furniture. He was a man alone, and in the Wild West, being alone was both a strength and a vulnerability. As he neared the ranch, a flicker of movement near the barn caught his eye. He reined in Comanche, his hand instinctively going to the Colt holstered at his hip. His eyes narrowed, straining to make out the figure in the fading light. It was a woman, huddled against the weathered wood of the barn, her form small and frail. A sense of unease prickled at the back of his neck. Women didn't just appear out here, not in the middle of nowhere, not alone, and certainly not at dusk. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The woman didn't stir, her head bowed, her body wrapped tightly in a dark, tattered shawl. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from a premonition he couldn't shake. He approached cautiously, his hand still on his weapon, his senses on high alert. He'd seen enough trouble in his life to know that sometimes, the quietest moments held the most danger. The air grew heavy with unspoken questions, with a tension that hummed like a taut wire. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. The woman flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. She slowly raised her head, and Nodin felt a jolt. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mess, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide, dark, and filled with a raw, desperate fear. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, endured too much. They were the eyes of a hunted animal. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, don't lift my shawl." Her words hung in the air, a plea that was both a warning and a desperate cry for help. Nodin hesitated, his gaze fixed on the dark fabric that concealed whatever secret she held. His mind raced, weighing the risks, the unknown. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to leave her to her fate. This was not his fight, not his burden. But then he looked into those desperate eyes again, and something shifted within him. A flicker of compassion, a spark of human kindness that he thought had long been extinguished. He knew in that moment that he couldn't just leave her. He couldn't. The decision was made, a silent pact with his conscience. He took a step closer, his hands still on his Colt, but his heart heavy with a moral uncertainty that would soon consume him. Section 2. Noden stood frozen, the woman's plea echoing in the vast silence of the prairie. His gaze flickered from her desperate eyes to the tattered shawl, a barrier between him and an unknown truth. He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town, the whispers of Indian raids, the fear-mongering of men like Jedediah Stone, who saw every shadow as a threat and every stranger as an enemy. Stone, with his self-righteous bluster and his posse of equally narrow-minded ranchers, would have left her for dead or worse, dragged her back to town for public scrutiny. Noden had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to make his own way without bowing to the prejudices of others. But this was different. This was a direct challenge to the unspoken rules of the frontier, a test of his own moral compass. He looked into those desperate eyes again and made the decision that would change everything. He lowered his hand from his Colt, a gesture of trust, a silent promise. "I won't," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "But you can't stay out here. It's too dangerous." The woman's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost palpable. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "My name is Alara." Noden led her to the ranch house, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. He offered her food, a warm blanket, and a quiet corner by the hearth. She ate sparingly, her movements slow and deliberate, like a wounded bird. He watched her, a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension churning within him. Who was she? What was she hiding? And why had she sought refuge at his isolated ranch? The next morning, word of Alara's presence spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. Noden had sent his foreman, a grizzled old-timer named Silas, into town for supplies, and Silas, a man who loved a good gossip more than a strong whiskey, had inadvertently let slip the news. By midday, a delegation from town arrived at Noden's ranch, led by none other than Jedediah Stone, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Noden," Stone boomed, his voice carrying across the yard. "What in tarnation is going on here? We hear you've taken in a stray." His eyes, cold and calculating, darted towards the ranch house, suspicion etched on his features. Behind him, a handful of other ranchers, their faces grim, nodded in agreement. Noden stepped forward, his posture unyielding. "She's a woman in need, Jedediah. Nothing more." "A woman in need?" Stone scoffed, his gaze hardening. "Or a spy? A renegade? We've had trouble enough with those redskins, Noden. You know that. And now you bring one of their kind into our midst." Noden's jaw tightened. "She's a human being, Jedediah, and she's under my roof. I won't have you or anyone else questioning my decisions on my own land." The other ranchers shifted uneasily, caught between Stone's aggressive stance and Noden's quiet authority. One of them, a younger man named Caleb, spoke up hesitantly. "But Noden, what if Stone's right? What if she's dangerous?" Alara, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped out into the sunlight, her shawl still wrapped tightly around her. Her eyes, though still wary, held a newfound strength. She met Stone's gaze, her chin held high. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I seek only refuge." Stone's eyes narrowed, his suspicion deepening. "Then lift your shawl, woman. Let us see who you truly are." Alara's hand instinctively went to the fabric, her knuckles white. Noden saw the fear return to her eyes, a deep, primal terror that made his gut clench. He stepped in front of her, shielding her from Stone's accusatory gaze. "She doesn't have to prove anything to you, Jedediah. Now, I suggest you and your men leave my property." The tension in the air was thick, a palpable force. Stone's face flushed with anger, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. "You're making a mistake, Noden," he snarled. "A big mistake. This ain't over." He turned, his posse following him, their footsteps heavy on the dusty ground. As they rode away, Nodin could feel their eyes on him, a silent judgment that promised future confrontation. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his act of kindness had just drawn a line in the sand, and he was now on the wrong side of it in the eyes of Redemption Gulch. Section 3. The days that followed were heavy with an unspoken dread. The air, usually crisp and clean, felt thick with anticipation, like the oppressive calm before a tornado. Nodin found himself constantly scanning the horizon, his senses heightened, every creak of the old ranch house, every rustle of the dry grass, a potential harbinger of trouble. Alara remained quiet, her presence a constant reminder of the precarious situation. She helped with chores, her movements graceful and efficient, but her eyes held a distant, haunted look, as if she were always listening for something only she could hear. Rumors, carried on the wind from Redemption Gulch, reached them through Silas, who continued his supply runs, albeit with a growing sense of unease. Jedediah Stone was stirring up the town, painting Nodin as a sympathizer, a traitor to their way of life. He spoke of Indian devils and savage women, fanning the flames of fear and prejudice. Silas reported seeing more men gathering at Stone's ranch, their faces grim, their rifles polished. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road, even distant ones, made Nodin's stomach drop. He knew they weren't just talking anymore. They were preparing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the western rim, painting the sky in fiery streaks, Nodin saw it. A thin wisp of smoke, barely visible against the darkening sky, rising from the distant hills. It was a signal, he knew, a message carried on the wind, meant for eyes that understood its silent language. His blood turned to ice. They weren't waiting for morning. The Comanche were coming tonight. He found Alara by the corral, her gaze fixed on the same distant smoke. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They're coming?" she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion, a chilling acceptance in her tone. "My people." Nodin nodded, his hand instinctively going to the worn leather of his rifle. "We need to prepare." "There is no preparing for this," Alara said, her voice still quiet, but with an underlying current of steel. "They will come for me, for what I carry." He looked at her, a question forming on his lips, but she shook her head, a silent plea for him not to ask. He respected her silence for now. There would be time for answers later if they survived the night. As darkness fully enveloped the ranch, the sounds of the prairie seemed to amplify. The chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, each sound seemed to hold a new, ominous meaning. Nodin positioned himself by the main window, his rifle resting on the sill, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape. Alara sat in a corner, her back against the wall, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. She was not praying, he realized, but listening, her connection to the land deeper than his own. Then, a new sound, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, reached them. The rhythmic thud of hooves, not the scattered gallop of a few riders, but the synchronized beat of many. Were drums, he thought, but there were no drums. Just the relentless, pounding rhythm of horses, a living, breathing wave of impending doom. He could almost feel the vibrations in the ground, a primal warning that resonated deep within his bones. He heard the whispers then, carried on the wind, a language he didn't understand, yet its intent was clear. They were close, too close. He saw shadows moving in the periphery of his vision, dark forms against the pale moonlight, silent and swift. They were surrounding the ranch, a tightening noose. He gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. Suddenly, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the night. It was a man's voice, speaking in the same unfamiliar tongue, but the tone was unmistakable, a demand. Alara flinched, her eyes snapping open. She looked at Nodin, a silent message passing between them. He knew what she was asking. He knew what he had to do, but the choice was impossible. Protect her, and face the wrath of an entire tribe, or surrender her, and betray the fragile trust they had built. The standoff had begun, and the night was long. Section for Nodin's gaze locked with Alara's, a silent conversation passing between them in the tense darkness. Her eyes, usually so guarded, now held a raw vulnerability, a plea that transcended words. He saw the fear, yes, but beneath it, a flicker of something else, a fierce, protective instinct. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that he could not surrender her. Not now. Not after the silent pact they had forged in the face of prejudice and danger. He would stand with her, whatever the cost. He turned back to the window, his voice low but firm. "They want you, don't they?" Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the shadows outside. "They believe I carry something that belongs to them. A legacy." She paused, then continued, her voice barely a whisper. "My mother, she was a healer, a keeper of stories. She carried the wisdom of our ancestors, woven into the patterns of her shawl. When she died, she passed it to me. They believe it holds power, a connection to the spirits." Nodin looked at the tattered shawl, a simple piece of fabric that now seemed imbued with a profound significance. He thought of his own family, a faded tintype photograph tucked away in a dusty drawer, a silent testament to a life he had left behind. His mother, her eyes kind and knowing, his father, strong and unyielding. He remembered the stories they told, the lessons they imparted, the invisible threads that connected him to his past. He understood, then, the weight of Alara's burden, the sacred trust she carried. Outside, the voice called out again, closer this time, more insistent. Alara flinched, her hand going to the shawl, clutching it tightly. "They will not understand," she said, her voice laced with despair. "They will only see what they want to see." Nodin turned to her, his expression resolute. "Then we will make them understand." He took a deep breath, then raised his voice, shouting into the night, his words echoing across the silent prairie. "I am Nodin. This woman is under my protection. She means you no harm." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that stretched on, broken only by the pounding of his own heart. Then, a single figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a feathered headdress and a face etched with the wisdom of years. He was the elder, the leader, his eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on Alara, then on Nodin. Alara stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, speaking in her native tongue. Nodin didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion, the raw honesty in her voice. She spoke of her mother, of the shawl, of the burden she carried. She spoke of Nodin's kindness, of his willingness to offer refuge, to see beyond the color of her skin, beyond the prejudices of his own people. She spoke of shared grief, of the universal human need for compassion, for understanding. She was telling them that judging Nodin for his kindness would make them no better than the soldiers who killed without asking questions first. The elder listened, his face impassive, his eyes never leaving Alara. When she finished, a long moment of silence passed. The air crackled with tension, the fate of the ranch of Nodin and Alara hanging in the balance. Then, slowly, the elder raised his hand, a gesture of peace. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant, and though Nodin didn't understand the words, he felt the shift in the air, the easing of the tension. It was not a surrender, but an acknowledgement, a challenge to rage, met with an offer of peace. The standoff had not ended in violence, but in a fragile, hard-won understanding. The night, though still long, no longer felt quite so heavy. Section 5. As dawn broke over the prairie, painting the eastern sky in soft hues of rose and gold, the Comanche warriors began to disperse, their departure as silent and swift as their arrival. Nodin watched from the porch, Alara beside him, the shawl still clutched in her hand. The elder, before he left, had turned to them, his gaze lingering on Alara, then on Nodin. He had spoken a few more words, his voice gentle, and Alara had translated, her voice thick with emotion. He says that the spirit of the land has spoken, that kindness is a language understood by all, and that the shawl, it has found its true home." Nodin felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying. The ranch, usually a place of quiet solitude, now felt different, imbued with a new kind of peace. The confrontation had not ended in bloodshed, but in a fragile, hard-won understanding, a testament to the power of human connection over prejudice. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her, and saw not just a woman in need, but a survivor, a keeper of ancient wisdom, a bridge between two worlds. In the days that followed, the whispers from Redemption Gulch faded, replaced by a grudging respect, or at least a cautious curiosity. Jedediah Stone, his bluster deflated by the unexpected outcome, kept his distance, his eyes still narrowed, but his words now held less venom. Silas, ever the pragmatist, simply grunted his approval, recognizing the shift in the wind. The ranch, once a symbol of Noden's isolation, became a quiet beacon of tolerance, a place where different paths could converge, where understanding could blossom. Alara stayed. She didn't speak much of her past, and Noden didn't press her. Their communication was often in gestures, in shared glances, in the quiet rhythm of their days. She taught him about the herbs of the prairie, their healing properties, their connection to the earth. He, in turn, showed her the rhythms of ranch life, the quiet satisfaction of hard work, the simple beauty of a sunrise over the plains. They were two solitary souls, brought together by circumstance, bound by a shared moment of courage and compassion. Years later, the ranch flourished. It became more than just a place of cattle and land. It became a sanctuary, a place where travelers, both white and native, could find respite, a safe haven from the harsh realities of the frontier. Alara, her face now etched with the wisdom of years, her eyes still holding that deep, knowing gaze, became a respected figure, a bridge between cultures. She never lifted her shawl for anyone else, but its significance was understood. It was a symbol of resilience, of heritage, and of the quiet strength that had frozen a millionaire rancher and, in doing so, had thawed his heart. Noden, the millionaire rancher, was no longer just a man of wealth and solitude. He was a man who had chosen kindness over fear, understanding over ignorance. He had learned that true richness lay not in gold, but in the connections forged in the crucible of adversity, in the quiet moments of shared humanity. And as he sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the vast, silent prairie, he knew, with a deep and abiding certainty, that he had made the right choice. The land, in its infinite wisdom, had taught him its most profound lesson, that even in the wild, untamed West, the most powerful force was not a gun, but a simple act of human kindness.